Photoshop has always had a slew of blur filters available, but they weren't that attractive to photographers. In Photoshop CS6, Adobe has introduced 3 new filters that photographers have been dying to get their hands on: Field Blur, Iris Blur, and Tilt Shift. The most basic of the 3 new blurs is Field Blur. This will allow you to create a simple overall blur or a blur from A to B. Of course, you can add C, D, E, and so on, but I think you might find that the other 2 blurs are more suited for that. When you first add the filter, you're given a single pin. This will help you define your blur. You might notice a ring that goes around your pin. Clicking and dragging inside this ring will increase or decrease the amount of blur. Alternatively, you can adjust the amount of blur by using the slider or input field on the right side of your workspace. To place an additional pin, simply click on the area that you want the new pin to appear. This new pin can act as either an additional blur or a visible area to your image. Once you have a second pin in place, just like we covered with the initial pin, you can adjust the amount of blur this pin creates. For this image, we're going to go ahead and remove the blur completely, creating a transition between the 2 pins. At any point, you can place your cursor inside the center of the pin and drag them around your canvas to adjust the direction of the blur. Now, one of the big requested features is the ability to add bokeh to your images. Bokeh is an effect that occurs to the light areas of the out of focus portions of an image. Depending on the lens that the image was taken with, some results may be more attractive than others. Many photographers strive for the rounded spots look. With Photoshop CS6, photographers can now simulate bokeh using the sliders at the bottom. The light bokeh slider controls how bright your final results will be. The further to the right you move this slider, the brighter the highlights in the blurred area will be. Bokeh color, as you might guess, adds color to the affected areas. This can help add emotion or temperature to your image. Typically, the results are quite subtle. The light range slider tells Photoshop which areas to modify. If you were to move the dark slider to the left, Photoshop will include more of the shadows and midtones of the image in the final result. Moving the light slider to the left would exclude some of the brighter areas. And finally, if you're looking to increase or decrease the actual size of the bokeh spots, this is controlled by the amount of blur which you defined earlier. At this point, you can go back and adjust the blur by either dragging the ring that surrounds the pin or by using the blur slider in the panel to the right. The second blur that's been introduced is Iris Blur. For those who are looking to focus on a single object in an image, the Iris Blur may be your best bet. Like the name implies, this blur creates an ellipse around the area of focus, which can be adjusted to include more or less of your photo. There are several elements to this blur ellipse. The 4 small squares that go around the outer ellipse are called ellipse handles. These give you the ability to adjust the size and rotation of the focus area by pulling them inwards, outwards, left, or right. Any part of the image outside the ellipse will be blurred by the amount you set using your blur ring or the blur slider. The larger white square, called the roundness knob, controls the radius of the ellipse. Pulling this handle outwards will create a rounded rectangle rather than a perfect circle. Pulling it back inwards will round out the ellipse once again. Moving on inwards, we have 4 white circles. These are the feather handles. Whether you're looking for a sharp transition or a gradual soft transition, these handles will help you achieve either one. Just like the roundness knob, these handles can be moved in or out to change the feathering. For natural results, you'll want to make sure that the handles are close to your focal point, but not completely covering it. Finally, like the rest of our blur tools, the blur ring and the center pin are available if you're looking to adjust the amount of blur or move the blur around your canvas. Now, the last blur that's available to you is a tilt shift blur. Tilt shifting is a process that gives your photos a miniature feel to them. However, not all photos will benefit from this effect. Typically, you should choose an overhead photo where the main subjects are at a distance from the camera, like the one you see here. Tilt shift can be found with the other 2 blurs under the filter menu at the top. Upon launching this blur, you'll notice a few friendly elements along with some new ones. As we've gone over before, our blurring allows us to adjust the amount of blur outside the focus zone, as well as move your blur anywhere on your canvas. Right below the blur ring, we have our rotate handle. Clicking and dragging on this handle will allow you to rotate your focus zone. The rectangle that your blur ring sits inside is called the focus zone. Anything that lies inside this zone will be 100% visible. You want to place your main subjects inside the focus zone. If your subject is bigger or smaller than the focus zone, you're able to adjust its size by pulling on either of the focus lines. Outside of the focus zone, we have our transition zone. This is where the blurring begins. To adjust the transition zone of the blur, the dashed line called the feather line can be moved just like the focus lines. A tighter transition zone can give the impression that the subjects were photographed closer to the camera. Our last zone is the blur zone. This area will be completely blurred, defined by the amount of blur you applied using either the blur ring or the slider to the right. Finally, on the right, we have a distortion slider. Dragging the slider left or right will slightly distort your blur within the blur zone. By default, you will only see distortion applied to the bottom section, but turning on symmetric distortion will apply it to both the top and the bottom of the blur zone. If all went well, your final image should look like a miniature representation of the actual image. And those are the 3 new blurs inside of Photoshop CS6. To find out what else is new in Photoshop CS6, head on over to iceflowstudios.com. Take care.